All right, Umberto was right. You're muted for some reason or another. No, don't type at me. You can. Oh, there you go. Hello?
Hello, Vaush.
So, by Umberto, do you mean Umberto Eco, the famed writer who nailed the 14 points of Eurofascism?
Oh, I'm not. That's surprising that you're actually familiar with him.
Yeah, he's my favorite anti-fascist writer. All right, my friendly.
Are you serious?
Yeah, my white
What's your
identitarian
favorite?
friend.
What's your favorite point of his 14 imperatives?
It would probably be either the cult of action for action's sake, or the oh fuck, the God help me, no, what was the other one? God damn it, it was that life is lived to be a hero, that people live to die. Essentially, I think those are some really really nice points that aren't well demonstrated in other bits of literature.
Yeah, I must say he was for basically liberal. He was fairly on point with the characterization of fascism. I think there's a tendency within the alt-right movement to kind of jot fascism down to a set of historical narratives, and try to avoid the discussion of semantically deciding what fascism is. And I think there's a certain anti-intellectualism that happens within alt-right movements that I really don't particularly enjoy.
Well, yeah, fascists are always going to be anti-intellectual, no?
Well, I disagree with that.
I'm sure you do. All right, hit me up. What's the argument?
So I think I discovered you maybe 2 weeks ago. So I watched a couple of your streams, and I think I appreciate what you're doing here, but I think you're a little bit short on actually discussing with us people that are a bit more on your par intellectual wise.
Hey, listen, that's not my fault, okay? The internet is what the internet is. I'm just living here.
I'm sure it is. But so, yeah, I think there's fairly well documented evidence, for example, that there is good reason to believe that there are legitimate differences in intelligence between groups, however you want to define those groups, whether you want to define those groups through arbitrary racial lines, through biological clads, through ethnicities. I think it's fairly uncritical to imagine a possibility within our evolutionary history where every measure of intelligence would be approximately the same, considering how evolution works historically.
I don't necessarily see a reason why evolution would lead to different racial groups having inherently different intelligences.
But so, I mean, again, the evidence speaks against that with every kind of mammal you want to look at, right? Even if you look at mammals that would have very relatively short evolutionary histories, like, for example, rats in Asia, especially in Africa, they've only actually evolved. They've evolved 4 times quicker than we have if you actually compare to, if you adjust for lifespan. Yet they have significant amount of intellectual differences, especially if you look at, for example, working memory capacity and short-term memory capacity.
Between which types of rats?
Between different there's 3 main species that are actually studied, and then within those 3 species, there's significant interspecies variation that has developed within the same time frame that has been adjusted for lifetime compared to humans.
Yeah, but there are a couple of differences. There are a couple of differences there, pretty important ones at that. First of all, humans the world over all live their lives, especially, ye back in the tribal days, in exactly the same way. Whether you lived in Nordic, Scandinavia, or you lived in Africa, or you lived as a native tribe in the Americas, life was pretty much the same. You foraged, you gathered, you hunted, you planted crops, you had a tight-knit tribal community, you occasionally did fights with other tribal communities that were tight-knit. Rats, however, and basically all types of species, in addition to being significantly less social animals, socialization being the main means by which humans acquire their intelligence, I mean, that's why we are what we are, because we're the socialist animals of all. They adapted to very, very different circumstances. Additionally, because of their heightened their heightened rate of evolution, considering the fact that they have shorter lifespans and breed more often, and the fact that their intellectual capacities are going to be determined by a smaller range of genealogical influences probably means that they're going to be more susceptible to intellectual, variance between individual species. Sorry, playing a game. Meanwhile, with humans, I mean, humans are pretty much the same all around, really. We don't have any hard evidence that there's any inherent genetic differences when it comes to intelligence between different racial groups, nor should we. The last time we had interracial gene mixing before modern plane travel was, I think, about 12,000 years ago, which is not much when it comes to evolution in the human lifespan. There are a bunch of stuff, like, it goes on like that. I just don't accept the intuition argument. Like, oh, of course, evolution must have had this influence. I don't buy that. I would need something more solid than that.
Right. And I mean, again, I'm not 100% convinced that there is no difference between intelligence, but I'm neither convinced that there isn't, right?
Well, we know there is a difference between intelligence. The matter is whether or not it's an inherent difference in intelligence,
Yes, and I'm assuming you're a bit familiar with some of the arguments given by, I'm sure you debated white nationalists with similar positions, but like, for example, the white and black IQ gap has reduced down to maybe 7 or 8 points, which does suggest that some of their variability within intelligence is actually explained by environmental factors.
Yeah. Well, right? we know that IQ responds to environmental factors. They've always known that.
But again, there's a huge the problem with these kind of is that there's a huge stigma within the peer review scientific community against anything to do with racial studies. And every time a research lab puts up a research proposal grant for federal funding of any kind, they get rejected simply based on the fact that they're just trying to understand IQ differences between races. And so we have to be very careful in our
I'm sorry, I don't think that's the case. There is robust discourse in the in the academic community about intelligence, inheritance, environment versus genes. I don't buy this either. Like, people talk about this a lot. This idea that, like, they don't want you researching more on this, but there's a lot of research on this. The problem is, all you can really conduct is studies which support the environmental argument, because we don't have the ability to, like, raise children from growth. Like, we know that environment's always going to be a factor, and all these studies can really do is estimate the degree to which environment really influences differences. We know, for example, from adopted twin studies, that environment, even from an incredibly young age, can have a huge difference on the IQ of black versus white children, and that there are sociological and psychological factors that influence it, even in ways that aren't directly environmental. So, for example, there was an interesting study that showed that people are more likely to do poorly on a test if they think they're going to do poorly on a test, that anticipation negatively influences their performance. Now, what are black people told about their intelligence? What are black people told about their IQ? In all likelihood, and I've seen some evidence that seems to substantiate this idea, it seems like black people might do worse on IQ tests in part just because they kind of write it off a little bit. Like, oh yeah, I know how this goes. Cool, whatever. And that does bias the results, even if it's by a point or two. It's a massive, massive potential difference.
I know, yeah, I'm familiar with those studies too. Like, obviously, there's a bunch of, but the thing is, even when these kind of things have been accounted for by the sheer history of IQ testing, right? We've been doing IQ testing since in the last 80 years, and obviously the shortening of the gap between the black and white IQs have been accounted by all these discrepancies that we're trying to account for. But nonetheless, there's still a gap that maintains.
Yeah, but the gap gets smaller every decade. I mean, isn't that an argument in my favor? We still haven't reached parity between black and white people economically or socially. It seems like every time we do this research, the gap closes like narrower and narrower. I feel like, if anything, that'd be a repudiation of your argument.
Again, but what I was trying to say, though, originally was that most of these studies actually were all conducted in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Very, very few of these studies have been conducted in the last 20 years.
That's not true. You said it's been reduced now to about an 8-point gap. I'm pretty sure that research came from no later than a decade ago, didn't it?
I think it was, 17 or 18 years ago.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've seen fairly recent studies. I know for a fact this is being researched even in like peer-reviewed academia, because I know that Flynn is still putting out research, the beloved environmental wizard that he is, and I know that, oh Christ, what's the name of that guy who's really, really up on his ass about trying to prove that it's black people genes or whatever. He does this research. I'm forgetting his name, but like this is all he does. He self-publishes. What's this guy's name?
No, it's the eugenist guy in the UK.
Yeah,
He has his own research institute. But I don't. I've read some of his papers, and they're clearly like just political manufacturing. Like he publishes in his own journal, and the peer reviewers are also like openly eugenist, like researchers, not really researchers. Most of them actually have just a master's degree, and they get accepted on the peer review panel.
yeah. There seems to be
Um,
a pretty strong pre-existing bias when it comes to that research, especially. Well, anyway, I don't think this is being under researched. I think a lot of it is just we cannot control for all sociological factors. It's pretty much impossible. We can estimate. Um, I just so wait, hold on. We can argue the hereditarianism of this until the cows come home, but um, you said that there were like policies that you were in favor of. So I'm curious about that because given the at the most charitable, the ambiguity of the evidence pointing to a genetic explanation for the black-white IQ gap, I feel like policy responses would be, I mean, at the very least, hasty and possibly quite counterproductive.
Well, I mean, generally, what I believe is, especially in terms of policy, I think we should be extremely more open towards positive eugenics. And and I think that would be maybe a possibility to bring more awareness to potentially have some negative eugenics, or not negative eugenics, but maybe have the idea of maybe keeping the different groups, evolutionary groups, separate, and to prevent a huge amount of mixing between groups among the planet.
Why? I mean, you're talking about an unprecedentedly authoritarian action that would violate basically every legal and ethical standard we have for human rights, all to assert a social policy which we have no evidence may or may not dissuade consequences from a IQ gap that we don't even know is genetic. I mean, like even if I agreed with all the priors here, and I certainly don't, it's like ludicrously I don't know, hasty action to take, don't you think? Like what actions do you even want to take? Like no interracial marriage, or what's the line there?
Well, I think like the first thing we should implement is a mandatory or universally paid for genetic testing, for that everyone can be aware of the potential genetic disorders that they're carrying, whether they're recessive or right, whatever kind of genetic disorders they have, to encourage them to not make children if they know that they would um, you know they would have the children that could possibly be carriers that would express the pathological phenotype, right?
I mean, I'm in favor of universal health care. If you say, hey, yeah, the government should be able to provide like genetic testing for people if they want it, then yeah, okay. I mean, that would just be
Because
part of
that's
the universal health care package to me.
yeah, well, that would be basically the biggest thing you can do to predictively I mean, increase IQ across the population, right? Because
How?
the biggest things that reduce IQ are actually things like, for example, pathological conditions that reduce like, for example, like schizophrenia, for example, reduces IQ by 7. It has very strong genetic predispositions that you can actually identify through a fairly basic genetic testing, right? 23andMe hasn't actually released their schizophrenia profile yet, but a lot of
I
scientists say
don't think
they're on it.
I don't think the
As,
presence or existence of people with lower IQ test scores harms society in any meaningful way. Like when I think of
well,
the
does.
problems in our society, it's a weird priority set to me because when I think about the problems in our society, whether we're talking about war or global warming or economic austerity or whatever million things are going on right now, I never think this could all be solved if only the low IQ people were excised from society. I mean, there's usually no relationship. Often it's the wealthy and comparatively high IQ people who are orchestrating a lot of the destructive political policies that hurt us. So I just don't know, like why would I look at all that and go like, okay, here's what we need to do. Okay, we need to spend $18 billion a year providing free genetic testing to excise the low IQ from our society. Like, what are we getting out of that? cost benefit wise.
Well, it's not negative eugenics, right? So you're not actually removing people who have a low IQ. You're just increasing the amount of high IQ people that will be born in the future, right?
Well,
And
sure. Well, I mean, you're aborting people who you believe will have a lower IQ.
well, it's not, abortion is one way, but ideally what would happen was that would be two consenting adults, have their genetic test, and they both, have, for example, the recessive gene for schizophrenia, and they decide not to have a children, right? And
Sure.
so that would,
Does this
right?
really
That
affect
would be
America
ideal.
that much?
But again, this is, I mean, again, there's probably way bigger issues if you want to talk about, but I think it's still, I think there's a virtue in wanting to live in a society where you have the possibility, where people have the capacity to have intellectual discussions, right?
We
And
already do,
but I
though.
think and there's also, I mean, I know it's just a correlation, but there is a correlation between economic value and IQ, right? And there's something to be said, especially in
There's a
terms of the
correlation
resource.
between social value and not adopting eugenics, though, right? I mean, like
So,
personally, I would rather live in a society that had a very strong stance on human rights, but had maybe a lower average IQ, than a society that had a slightly higher average IQ, but was
yeah, but they're not
reprehensible.
exclusive things, right? You can still have human rights and have higher IQs, right? And
If we're
higher IQs also, they also reduce the burden on the overall system, right? You have less people needing to have services. You have less people in the hospitals, and
Yeah, but
right.
if we're just talking about the government allowing people to get free genetic screening, that I don't really have much of an issue with that because I don't think that's necessarily eugenics. It would just be a component of a broader healthcare plan that I would probably be in favor of.
Well, it
Um,
is it's positive. It's positive eugenics, right? It has measurable impacts on the gene pool, right? It reduces pathological conditions from appearing. So that's right. It's a form of eugenics.
sure, sure, but we're talking, I imagine, about race stuff. That's the context in which this originally got discussed.
Right.
So to what end would you want to make moves in that?
Well, to be honest, I'm a bit maybe hesitant to have very strong opinions on having very like strong racial policies or anything like that, because I do agree with the science that it's still, I think it would be ambitious to say that there really is an intelligence difference between racial groups, for example, and that we should have policies to make sure that these different racial groups don't mix together. But I wouldn't, because there is a predominance within the liberal and left media to just assume there isn't, and to not
Well,
even think about
sure.
any
I mean, there's no
outcomes we should do
evidence.
at all, right?
And even if there was evidence of it, it wouldn't change any of my policies. Even if you could somehow prove black people just genetically were like 8 IQ points lower, I'd still argue for every prescriptive policy that I do. It wouldn't change a goddamn thing. I mean,
Mm.
I still don't believe they are, and it's important to argue that they're not because you don't want to concede that argument. But, well, I mean, what would change? Like, what difference would it make?
I mean, again, you can make quite a bit of a good indirect argument for the position that lower IQs tend to increase instability in a political society, right?
I
It
just don't see
creates,
any evidence of that.
but again, there's descriptive evidence that differences between IQ lead to political instability.
Well, you know that differences in IQ can correlate with instability, but so does income inequality. And income inequality is simultaneously the greatest predictor of political instability and one of the greatest predictors of a lower IQ. So it
Yeah,
could just be a correlative factor there, and the causative factor is actually being caused by something else.
yes, obviously, like you can basically switch lower IQ with poverty and lower socioeconomic status, and those two variables would be intercorrelated, right?
Yeah, well, then
And
let's fight
yeah,
poverty, huh?
yeah. I mean, I do agree that capitalism has a vast negative effect on our society, but nonetheless, just because you know trying to reduce poverty might lead to positive effects, we should maybe also talk about trying to lower the amount of low IQ people in the society. Maybe if you can do a double whammy, right? You increase IQ and you also decrease poverty to
Well,
have better effects.
by decreasing poverty, you give more people access to higher education, which would lead to on the board higher IQ scores. I don't really think that high IQ scores are necessarily like a super important thing to fight for. You can usually raise them just by giving people good lives and access to education, but once you start like printing around in people's genetic code, it seems like we're getting a little counterproductive. I mean, like if we agree that education is like the real indicator there. Like that's the actual underlying thing to focus on. Why even talk about race? What's the point?
I mean, the point is that you want to have an inquisitive and motivating, creative mind, and you want to try to solve these scientific problems,
What
right? To
scientific
just,
problem?
I mean, the scientific problem of trying to understand human intelligence, whether the variability is truly simply an interspecies variability or between group species variability, right? That in itself is an interesting scientific and
But we
evolutionary
we
question
are
that we
doing
should
that.
ask.
What does that have to do with political policies? Uh, with regards to like preventing interracial marriage and stuff. We already study this stuff. We're not ignoring it. I
Right.
mean, we look into it and stuff, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I could just disagree with you on that. Um, but
It also just doesn't seem
again,
like that important of an issue for the most part. Because again, like if your issue here is like people not being educated, you fix education. If it's people being poor, you try to fix poverty. I just don't know what you get out of, because if you think that IQ, like genetic IQ racial differences, are the real heart of the problem, first of all, I mean, you'd have to prove it, and we just don't have that data. And then second of all, you would have to embark in some egregious social policy to do anything about that. I mean, because education, that's pretty simple. Put money into it, invest, maybe do some testing, see what kind of schooling works better. Poverty, we know how to fix stuff like that as long as there's the will to do it. IQ differences between races, like, okay, who are we genociding first, It's a whole mess. Um and probably honestly not worth that much scientific inquiry besides what we already put into it.
yeah, I mean, but like, if I can ask you a question, do you really think there's nothing can happen that would negatively affect this social ecosystem when you have varying levels of IQ or also varying levels of cultural immigration?
Well,
You
I
not
don't know
think
what cultural immigration has to do with this, but we already, every society that's ever existed has variances in IQ. Individuals vary amongst racial groups.
right?
Right. Yeah,
And
but that's always going to happen. I mean, forever. Even if you have an all white, not just all white, all Aryan society, okay, that doesn't mean there's not going to be IQ variance within that population. But that just isn't a problem that really seems to hurt society. There's just no descriptive evidence of that. Like when you look at society, what causes its flaws? Well, it's IQ variance. Not usually. The big problems in society are usually caused by power imbalances. People using their power to hurt those below them, whether it be through capitalism or inequitable exchange of resources from one country to another or whatever. But not low IQ people. Low IQ people didn't cause climate change. Low IQ people didn't cause income inequality. I just, of all the problems.
yeah, I guess I like, the thing is, I'm kind of agreeing with you, but I'm also disagreeing in the sense that I think our political ecosystem would be extremely different if the bottom standard deviation of IQ would be 10 IQs higher, right? And
Wait,
one
how
way
would you
to
do that
increase
though?
that again is you do some, like what I said, positive eugenics, and the other way is you do massive increases in public education. You do philosophy, mandatory philosophy undergraduate degree. Like, imagine if everyone like the mandatory educational system had an undergrad in the humanities or the arts, right? Like, and imagine if people had the capacity and the IQ to actually go through with that and come out as a critical thinking person. Like,
Look,
imagine
I'm not
the
opposed
type.
to bettering education. Just
Yeah,
you're the bettering education. That's great and all, but we're already doing that. Like the moving forward, like this whole interest in genetics. What influence does it have on our ability to address these? Excuse me, these problems.
sorry, my computer just. Can you just repeat what you said?
What
Ah,
influence does our investigation into genetics have on our ability to address these issues? We can already address education without needing to separate the races. And whatever problems would be caused by separating the races would no doubt exceed whatever problems we have with IQ. I don't even know if we have any
yeah.
problems with IQ.
So I guess I'll try to make it clear what my worry is. So my worry is, let's say, for example, that there really is genetic IQ differences between groups of the Homo sapiens, right? and let's say that's 10 IQ or something. And so the worry I have is if we have this policy of encouraging intergroup
Wait, we don't. Well, we don't
production of,
encourage it. It's just allowed.
yeah, well, I mean, again, it used to be not allowed in a very culturally normative kind of imposed order, right? It was very frowned upon, and now it's a lot less frowned upon. So in a cultural way, it's basically allowed.
Well,
And
yeah, it's allowed, but we're not like pushing people into it. We're not forcing people to get interracially married or anything like that.
oh yeah, no, I'm not saying there's a state imperative that forces a certain quota of affirmative action in terms of interracial marriage. I'm just saying that by virtue of not having discouragements in the cultural ecosystem, we effectively allow it, right?
Yeah,
And
we allow it, but just not encourage it. I think we're
yeah
pretty neutral on the matter.
So my worry is that, for example, if there really is a 10 IQ difference, and or in the next 100 years we interbreed within all the groups, then the overall IQ will actually go down.
Say there is a difference. Say you could prove that 10 IQ point difference, genetic. Okay,
Right.
why should there be any government policy or any social push to change anything? Like, shouldn't that be the people's right? People want to go ahead and marry black people if they're white. Isn't that their right as an American citizen?
Well, yeah. So I consider myself more of like a libertarian, like fascist. So I mean, it's a bit of a strange conception, but
I would say so.
in a sense that I I think we should actively encourage people. Yeah. So let's say, for example, we have a very strong consensus on this 10 IQ difference. We should make it our imperative to inform people of this, and people should be free to decide whether they want to marry someone of a different group, right?
But the
But I don't
thing
think we
is,
should use
that's
the state
already
of power.
happened. The
Right.
narrative that black people are genetically less intelligent than white people has been the predominant social narrative for 400 years. It's only been in the past 30, 40 or so years that narrative has been pushed back on. So people had all the time in the world to internalize this narrative. We tried it that way. And still no harm seems to come from, what would you call it, race mixing. Society is more stable than it ever was before. The establishment of a de facto caste system within a country is an extremely strong destabilizer.
I mean, I'm not sure you can make a very strong argument for that.
For
There
caste
is
systems being destabilizing?
well, not for caste system, for the idea that mixing. But again, the problem is that there's a very large. I guess it's difficult to differentiate the variables here, but there seem like it's hard to say whether one effect is due to culture, whether it's due to differences in IQ, right? So there is like unconventional. It's like a very large concession in sociology that if you put different cultures together, it will increase social instability, right?
No,
And so
I don't think that's a given at all, really.
how is that not a given?
Because
Can you
monocultural societies usually end up turning into despotic militaristic states that burn themselves out. Having one predominant culture that society explicitly encourages to the expense of others usually leads to the type of political and social attitudes that cause warfare, strife, and inequality. Supremacist attitudes, which is basically what you're advocating for. Nobody advocates apartheid without implicitly suggesting the supremacy of their own group, lead to social instability. Whereas allowing people to integrate and what have you, I mean, with taco trucks on every corner, what's being destabilized there? You have the largest cultural intermixing in American history happening right now, and it's happening between Mexicans and Americans. But we don't have any problems at all. They contribute to the economy, even the illegal immigrants. They contribute to the economy. They
I
provide
mean,
us huh?
how is there no problem? Like there's the United States, for example, is the only Western country that has, for example, like 10 times the amount of white nationalist militia groups that are coming up and arming themselves against their what they see as an invasion and threat from
That's their
an
problem. Wait,
opposing
that's not.
culture.
It's the
No, but it's
Mexicans.
political instability. You can't say that's not political instability. That is a
Well, yeah,
very
but it's
clear
political
empirical.
instability created by people like you, not by people like them. Because trust me, there were plenty of violent white militias before Mexicans started coming here, like the Ku Klux Klan. It doesn't take integration and intermixing for groups like that to rise up. It takes people like you who fearmonger about different cultures. So I
But yeah,
can't really
people
put
like
that one on the Mexicans, you know?
people like me only exist because of the preconditions that are
No,
around us,
people
right?
like you have existed for hundreds of years before we even had any non-white immigrants to this country. The predominant narrative that whites are better, higher IQ, and that society should be kept to their interests, that's the oldest Western narrative. It's only recently that that's started to pull apart. But even back when that was the predominant narrative, there were plenty of violent white supremacist groups that would go around lynching poor black folks, escaped or even unescaped slaves for imagined crimes. There were people who would go and terrorize the Irish, even though the Irish are by any modern definition white, they would go ahead and do it anyway, because supremacy, the attitudes surrounding it, aren't caused by the existence of difference. They're caused by the fear of difference. But that fear can happen whether or not Mexicans are pouring in over the border, you know?
I just disagree. Like for example, like you can look at, for example, Scandinavia, right? If you look at the post-war period, in especially Norway, they had a very large socialist movement that basically the Socialist Party, led by Geidhard something, basically was in power for 25 years. And because of the cultural homogeneity that existed in Norway and the strong push against the capitalist forces that were dominating their industry, they managed to create a very large welfare state. The
What does cultural homogeneity have to do with that?
I mean, I'll get to it. I'm right, and I mean, cultural homogeneity. It's a precursor for a welfare state because it is to have a welfare
How?
state. You have to have the idea that everyone is your neighbor. You're all a big community, and when you pay taxes, it goes towards people that are your comrades,
Wait,
right?
wait, wait, wait. No, no,
And
no, no. Hold on. Wait. You're completely making this up. There's nothing in the functionality of a welfare state which requires that people believe their money is always only going to people of the same race. That's has nothing to
no,
do
no.
with how welfare states work. Welfare
Again,
states
I'm not.
work.
I'm not saying it's an exclusive criteria. I'm saying it's a criteria that helps maintain, the integrity of the
Wait, you
system.
can't again, you can't keep blaming minorities for racism. If people stop believing in a welfare state because they don't want brown people to get the benefits, that's on you. The problem there is not the diversity. The problem there is the reactionary. That's your ideology. In fact, over here in America, interracial or otherwise like racially diverse working communities are more likely to want to unionize than like homogenous white communities. The reason why it's harder for them is usually because white people in those interracial communities are less amicable to getting along together with interracial groups. Now, mind you, Latin people willing to get along with whites, black people willing to get along with whites, white people not willing to get along with either. That sounds to me like a white people problem more so than it does a diversity problem. Something about them consuming propaganda, not so
Right.
much having to
I
do
mean,
with diversity itself.
I just argue that when you see collaboration between ethnic and racial groups when it comes to, for example, labor setting, I think that's just successful organizing from the union organizers, right? Like there's especially if you look at the United States history, there's a long history of socialist organizers. I think if you look at the coal mining strikes in West Virginia, where a lot of the workers were, of Italian and Polish, backgrounds, and there's also a lot of black workers. And so the goal of the socialist organizer was to say, your racial divides are not important. What matters is that the boss is stealing, and then they actually were able to, have solidarity together. And
Yeah,
so, but
so I agree.
but
Cultural diversity and intersectionality and anti-racism work to bring the working class together.
yeah, but again, those are the exceptions, right? So those only work when you have a very effective propaganda campaign by socialist organizers to remove, the type
To,
of,
to remove
into it.
the other very effective type of propaganda campaign, that is to say, centuries of ingrained systemic racism. They're not fighting
Yeah,
against humans' natural behaviors here. They're fighting against the politicians and workers and bosses who would deliberately disseminate racist propaganda to try to split up the working class. And that tactic's been going on for a real goddamn long time. Very effective way of keeping capitalism if you can convince white workers they're better than black workers, you know?
yeah. But I think the thing is, I think you're dismissing my point of view because you think yours overrides mine. But I think they're both compatible.
Well, your
I think.
point of view is literally that racism is minorities' fault.
Well, no, I'm saying that, for example, if you go back to Norway, um, the phenomena that is the most predictive for explaining what's happening in Norway, especially since the immigration crisis, is that you had a very strong socialist movement that was culturally homogeneous, and then over the last 10 years, there's been rising political instability
That's not
caused by.
true. The
I mean,
socialists, the
it's
socialists in
empirically true.
Sweden lost decades ago. It wasn't like socialism, like the socialist forces in Sweden were going strong until like 2014, and then things went downhill. That's not
Well,
the
it's
case
true
at
that
all.
I mean, you had the between the years of the 50s to the 70s, you had a very strong socialist movement, and it got taken over by the neoliberals.
The
But then
neoliberals took over when Sweden was majority white. You're blaming this on minorities when they weren't even really in the country at the time. This is what I mean. I mean, these problems exist with or without minorities. You're doing the thing. You're sowing division and misleading people on what the actual problems are.
but I mean, there's still a difference between the privatization that was done by neoliberal, politicians, and then the further destabilization and more of a privatization of the welfare state done by, an immigration crisis that increased political
The
tension.
immigration crisis doesn't force politicians to do anything, okay? The immigration
No,
crisis
no,
was
no.
a serious problem that was caused in
Yes.
large part by Western interventionism. We pick up the pieces of what we break. That's the rule. That's only fair. And now there are going to be social problems from that. If you pour millions of refugees into Europe, of course there are going to be problems. But that's not even a problem with cultural differences. Refugees bring their own set of problems. They're from a war torn country. They probably haven't had the opportunity to live a stable life or get a good education. That has, even if they were of the same culture, I mean, even if we were talking about like Western Europeans having to refugee move to some other part of Western Europe, there would still be huge, huge problems with that. We know that because there have been diasporas from within America to other parts of America that have led to the same damn problems. And we also know what the consequences were of many of the areas in the Confederacy that were war torn that ended up having to reintegrate into broader society afterwards. We've seen the consequences of this. I just don't see where cultural differences play into it, and I certainly don't buy this narrative that minority groups are responsible for the racism they suffer because you could only
No.
be racist if there are people to be racist against. I mean, that's not true.
No, I'm not. I'm not really talking about the racism that like the racism that the refugees are suffering from. I'm talking about the effects that the refugees have in destabilizing the trust that the indigenous population in Norway, for example, have in the welfare state.
That is not.
Eh,
Wait, hold on. Wait, hold on. Again, this is like nonsense mumbo jumbo. It doesn't work like that. I'm
How
going
does it
around
not
my
work like
words.
that?
You can't say destabilize the trust. If they lose trust in an institution because brown people come in, that's their fault. That has nothing to do with culture or diversity.
It's a fault of who the population.
Yeah. If they give up
Again,
on a welfare state because scary brown people come
I'm
in,
not
yeah,
because
fuck them. They deserve
you're
what they
you're
get.
you're the one who's blaming here. I'm just describing what's
No,
going on.
yeah,
I'm
I'm
not saying.
blaming because they're the one who did it. I'm sorry, were the Muslim refugees the ones who voted in parliament to do X or Y? No, they weren't
But I'm
citizens.
saying again, I'm not interested in blaming a group or the other. I'm just saying I'm trying to
You
understand the relationships here.
you're
How
directly blaming you are trying to blame. You're directly blaming refugees for this, and you're trying to say that diversity is the cause of these problems. You are assigning blame.
I'm just saying that there's a fairly large correlation between an influx in less culturally cohesive groups in a society and a
Wait,
distrust in a welfare state.
why less culturally cohesive? What does that mean? Also, you can say that there's a correlation, but that doesn't mean they're at fault. Maybe the fault is racist people. I can justify that claim pretty easily because the history of American labor strikes has basically been defined by worker solidarity versus racists. That's pretty much how it's panned out that way for like 150 years, you know?
Right.
So like I'll blame people, yeah, sure, but I'll blame the things that actually cause the problems. Not like it'd be like saying like well, you know, I'm not blaming anyone, but the presence of black people in the South did lead to a lot more lynchings. Like, okay, that may be technically true. I don't feel like they're the ones to blame for that necessarily. Feel like it'd be better to direct our energies towards the cause of that issue.
Well, I'd argue, for example, that the presence of African Americans in the United States is a fairly big causative factor in the reason why the United States doesn't have a single payer system. think you
Maybe
can,
because of racists? I mean, sure, fuck
but
the
again,
racists. Let's deport them, huh? They're probably pretty low
but
IQ.
what I'm trying to say here, though, is that racism isn't something that you can just repress by shaming people. It's a necessary condition that
It is
arrives
not
out of
necessary by any means.
stability in a society,
It is,
right?
no,
No,
it's
but
not.
again,
Wait, again, wait, we're going in circles right now. Hold on, wait. I need to fight Ludwig the Accursed, so I need to wrap this up, okay? First of all, racism is absolutely not a necessary or intrinsic component of human behavior. We know that because older societies didn't have it the way we have it. They had tribalism, which is an inherent component of human behavior, not racism. It didn't work the way that we have it work. Second,
the difference between tribalism and racism isn't semantically meaningful.
it is wait, hold on. It's extremely meaningful. The fact that humans form arguments and form groups and divide themselves does not mean that there's an inherent need for people to do so along racial lines. Tribalism can be as simple as people liking their sports team over the enemy sports team. Like, it can be that simple. It can be socially harmless, and often it is, because I enact tribalism all the time, like when I make fun of British people. But it doesn't harm society. Additionally, you have this persistent tendency of blaming minority groups for the behavior of people who act like you. It's really weird because you're the one arguing for segregation, for apartheid, for genetic what have you, and then you're like, well, when you look at it, it turns out the presence of minorities leads to more racism. Dude, that's on you, okay? That's not, you can't blame them for that. It's not an inherent thing. We have plenty of studies showing that interracial communities in, say, the heart of Los Angeles are more amicable to cohabilitation and getting along. In fact that the most racist people in this country are the people least likely to have ever met a black person completely disproves your argument. Exposure to different racial groups makes it more likely you'll be willing to get along with them, meaning that it's not exposure to different races that cause racism, it's ignorance and hatred, which can exist with or without Mexicans in this country. So, yeah, this just doesn't follow.
Again, this is kind of, it's a process, right? Obviously the evidence that you're citing is true. So if you have a child who grows up in a very a mixed environment, they'll have a way less racist tendencies, right? But the problem is that the majority of most Western countries don't grow up in a type of multicultural environment, and so they will harbor racist
we'll
views.
fix that though. We'll get it. Don't worry. We're getting there.
But it's a process, right? So like you have to wager whether it's worth destroying your welfare state for the next 40 years.
We're not wait, hold on. America doesn't have a welfare state to destroy, and the existence of minorities didn't destroy the welfare state. And whether or not the existence of minorities did destroy the welfare state, the minorities are already here. Do you think waging war on the 120 million non-white Americans would make society more stable? No, they're here whether we like it or not. So since they are here, and I'm happy with them being here, by the way, let's work to fix the real issue, the thing you've acknowledged is the issue, which is racial hatred. Like, if you have a problem with the people not wanting to build a welfare state because black people will benefit from it, why not blame the racists who deliberately lie, who sow hatred and division, rather than just the black people who exist here? Like, why blame the latter over the former? It's also way easier to fight racism than to make America an ethno-state. I mean, that's a much easier sell,
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess my argument probably makes more sense for European countries. It's true that it would be more difficult to enact in the United States, where there's already fairly high amount of multiculturalism.
There's already plenty of it in Europe as well, and there will only be more with time, and it will be better for it. And people like, with all due respect, people like you will become less and less common, and this whole imagined issue, well, come on, this whole imagined issue will really go away. The only thing we need to get rid of these problems is to get rid of the people who caused them. But only 13% of the world is white, I think, give or take. It's not 87% of the world that's causing this issue. It's the minority of a minority of people who think that you can't have a welfare state because black people would benefit from it. Why not blame Reagan? I mean, he promoted all that welfare queen bullshit.
I mean, racial issues and political instability that is caused by that is not only present in Europe and North America, right? Like India is rife with these kind of issues, and most countries are, right?
Yeah, but not in the way that we have it.
China, but
I mean, in America, all Indian people are the same. But in India, they find differences amongst themselves, which really, really lends credence to the idea that these divisions are not caused by some essential human nature, but rather by authoritarians who seize power by demonizing and otherizing a minority group. That's what they're doing right now in India.
Oh no, in India, there's significant ethnic diversity,
Not
and
that
there's also
Americans would
religious
recognize.
diversity.
Americans would see them all the same because it's
But
totally
it doesn't
arbitrary.
matter. Again, it's not arbitrary, right? There's many scientific studies on this.
But not that Americans would care about. Americans will see one Indian to another Indian to another Indian, and it'll be like, oh, yep, those are Indians. Totally arbitrary. It's just
But
the
why
same
does it
story
matter
everywhere. People
what
who benefit from
America
sowing
thinks?
hatred.
Right. I just don't understand why you're trying to contextualize this with the framework of what America thinks about India.
Because the point that I'm making is that these are social problems that are caused by the same factors everywhere around, that they're arbitrary. These social problems are caused by racists, by segregationists, by xenophobes. They're not caused by inherent differences between racial groups. If they were caused by inherent differences between racial groups, then you wouldn't see these kinds of ethnic or social conflicts arise in racially homogeneous countries. Like, say, for example, most of Japan. Japan's super homogeneous, but there are still significant social clashes within it that don't fall along racial lines. This lends credence to the idea that race is not the dominant factor here. Rather, it's human social organization, something we're capable of changing.
I'm not sure that's true. Like in Japan, there's extreme racism, especially when it comes to Koreans and Chinese and
Yeah, we'll fix it.
Taiwanese. Yeah,
I'll go over there soon. I'm gonna visit. Okay, I'm a weeb. I gotta go over there. Gotta get my merch. I'll go over there. I'll fix racism on the way.
At the very least, though, could you at least concede that it's a kind of a chicken and egg problem, right? So it's hard to differentiate between what comes first. Is it the cultural institution of racism, or is it the biological components that is part of our tribalistic mentality?
Given the fact that most people are more likely to be racist the less they interact with other races, I'm going to go ahead and say that the racism is the real issue here. That the existence of other racial groups doesn't cause racism. I mean, for God's sake, Nazi Germany, it wasn't like they were pretty hateful of other racial groups. They didn't have any in their country, not after they got rid of them. What about Imperial Japan? Imperial Japan was literally ethnically homogeneous. I mean, it was completely like just 100%, and they despised other groups. So what's the difference there? It couldn't have been the existence of other racial groups because there were none in Japan. It had to have been something else.
But that's you're like arbitrarily defining what Japan was, right? But Japan at the time wasn't just the island of Japan. It was the the nascent empire, right?
Because they conquered them, thinking they were lesser people. They were racist before their society was even remotely impacted by other ethnic groups. That's the thing. The racism happens first. The racism doesn't need racial differences. People like you will find fights if you look for them.
Okay, I see what you're saying. You're saying since there wasn't much racial division prior to the imperial pursuit of Japan, it doesn't lead credence to the argument that instability caused by different racial groups leads to more racism, basically.
Yeah, you find racists where there are no racial differences, and people become less racist the more they're exposed to other races. So it seems like the racism just emerges from social characteristics, like, propaganda, or traditionalist values or reactionary tendencies or what have you, but they're not caused by the existence of other races. I'll tell you this much. If we got rid of all the black and brown people in this country would not be any less racist as a white ethno-state. We would not get rid of racism in this country, okay? You just got to tap out racism. That's the problem.
That's a good point. I didn't really think much about the effect of like mass propaganda and like perpetuating racist.
Well, I have to go fight and probably die a bunch to Ludwig. Will you wish me luck?
I wish you luck. Thanks for the enlightened discussion. I enjoyed that.
Be well.
I'll keep watching you. See ya.
Peace.